As educators, we often talk to our students about the importance of having a growth mindset. In fact, in a very short but successful stint as a basketball coach, I constantly reaffirm for players that having a growth mindset in something like a physical activity is really necessary. So I think a lot of us buy into that philosophy. But what does that look like when students leave our particular class and transition to what's next for them, whether that be another class or maybe even more importantly, when they transition out of education into their work life? How does that growth mindset stick with them? It's not something you have or don't have. You have to continue building that. What does that look like? That's going to be the topic of the discussion on today's Teaching Matters.
Welcome to Teaching Matters, a podcast exploring all things teaching and learning. Teaching Matters is produced by NPR affiliate WOUV Public Media in Athens, Ohio. And here is your host, Dr. Scott Titsworth, Dean of the Scripps College of Communication at Ohio University.
My guest today is Karen Atwell. She's the CEO and Chief Strategist at Dynamic Perspectives. Karen's work in that role involves activities in consulting with multiple Fortune 500 companies and nonprofit organizations. Her specialty is organizational consulting surrounding topics such as talent assessment, management, and development. You might wonder, why is Karen on Teaching Matters? She also has taught before, and she's also actively involved with her alma mater in terms of giving feedback to academic programs. And she has a very good perspective, I think, to help us understand this idea of growth mindset. Karen, thank you so much for giving us your time today and being on the podcast.
Thank you, Scott. I'm so glad to be here.
Absolutely. I actually do want to start just by having you talk a little bit more about your background before we get into the growth mindset information. What led you into consulting, and what is sort of a typical time period like in your work life so that the audience members who may not be as familiar with that might get some understanding of sort of what a consultant is and what you do?
Yes, that's a great question. So I think people, in fact, I was on the phone earlier today with somebody who's thinking about leaving their work career and going into consulting. I think people accumulate a certain amount of knowledge and experience in their work life. Certainly I did. I started in sales. I've worked in a number of different industries. I finally went into sales management and eventually sales leadership and then executive leadership. And at some point I said, boy, I've accumulated a lot of different experiences. And I see a lot of things that I'd like to see done differently. I have great ideas for what might be done differently. So I took that and parlayed it into a consulting practice that was jettisoned because I was laid off in 2008. So there was a life event that happened that said, you have an opportunity here to think of your life differently. And I took that advantage and went into consulting at that time. My typical day is actually spent running the company, because the company is no longer just me. I am not a single consultant. We have a number of people within the organization. I do speak with clients frequently. I advise clients. I personally don't do a lot of individual coaching any longer, but certainly people in my organization do. We do a lot of leader development, so we teach classes all over the country, some virtually, some in person. And I would say that a lot of my time is spent in strategy. When you have a consulting company, it's a lot more than just going out and consulting. In fact, that's the smallest thing that you do. The majority of it is actually figuring out what your website needs to look like and what resources do you need. And, it's actually sort of running the company to get to the clients. So that just gives you a little bit of a taste for what I do.
When I'm talking with students about the world of consulting, especially students that are, majoring in organizational communication or strategic communication, it's a topic of conversation, as you can imagine. One of the things I tell them is that consultants do a lot of different things for organizations, but one way to think about it is that they are the professional educators that comes into an organization to help them solve a problem through growth. Economic growth necessarily, but growth of individuals, growth of company practices. Do you agree with that assessment? So am I telling students the wrong thing? But how does that sort of show us that the idea of lifelong learning sticks with this and that consultants are a part of that for large organizations or even small organizations?
So first of all, consultants are looked, clients look to us to know something they don't know. They're looking for what I call outsight. If we operate only with what we know inside our own head, all we do is tell ourselves what we already know to be true, right? And that's a big leadership issue, actually. So when clients bring in, or companies decide to bring in some outside expertise, they're expecting that we have answers and that we're willing to give them answers and direction. So it's incumbent on people who live in the consulting space, whether you're at the bottom of the ladder at Anderson Consulting or whether you've decided to go out and do your own thing. It's incumbent on us to be constantly learning, looking for new information, seeing what's important. I mean, who would have seen COVID coming and how that changed the world so much? We have to be agile and flexible and resilient and all of those things to stay ahead of our clients so that we can be valuable, right? So
Absolutely. So I've known you for about 20 years or some time period close to that, right? It's been a minute that we've known each other. And the whole time that I've known you, you've been somebody that is very positive in working with our students. And in fact, in reflecting on the way that you've interacted with many of the majors in our college, I remember you talking about sort of continual growth. Why is it that you think the growth mindset and that mindset perspective is such an important concept for students at various levels to begin developing? I think we talk about it a lot, but why is it so important?
right. The back in the day, back in the 80s and the 70s, there used to be books and articles about how when you are faced with a change, this is how you handle it. Sometime between the 80s and now, this whole thing has been sped up, and I think technology has had a lot to do with that. But there is no constant anymore. The only constant is change, and I'm sure everybody's heard that expression before. So it's important for everyone to have a growth mindset. I run into this when we talk about generational differences in the workplace. People that are my age, I'm a baby boomer. They don't know why the young people don't come in and sit down and be quiet and do their work and do it the way they used to do it. Young people come into the workplace today and they have this mindset of there is a new sheriff in town. We're doing things differently now. And the old folks need to get it together and realize that things are shifting and changing. When we come together with these mindsets that are rigid, we create conflict. It doesn't even need to be there. So in my mind, the growth mindset is what I refer to as a learner mindset. You're either in the mindset of learning or you're in the mindset of judging. If we live in that judger mindset, nothing will get done. It'll be chaos and conflict, and it's just a much more of an uphill battle. And unfortunately for students getting their first jobs or second jobs, they're going to go before some executive is going to get let go because they didn't, you know what I mean? So it's really important that all of us show up in the workplace with sort of this far more agile learning mindset than we've had to have before.
So my background in communication, but also a lot of study and topics related to education, this concept of growth mindset comes up, quite a bit. And you're right, it's more recent, but it's definitely a part of the training that we provide teachers and hopefully students. An old school perspective on sort of the idea of a skill set, I'm going to use a different word, is that you either have it or you don't have it. You either have the skill to do something like public speaking, for example, or you don't have that skill. You have the skill to play basketball or you don't have it. It's a very old school mindset, but it was present. We both probably grew up with it to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
Mindset around growth is different, where it is much more evolving and developmental. How do you see, or how would you talk about sort of the stages through which people would develop a mindset that eventually, when they're an adult in a workplace situation, is something that they've built along the way? I mean, how do you start that? I know that your background is not in childhood education, but if we just think about it as parents, as people that are working with younger individuals, we have to help them grow. And that's part of the growth mindset. But what does it look like as a developmental process, do you think?
But when I think of the whole person, I think that growth mindset is with you from childhood all the way up to when you die. You'll remember that I got my master's degree in communications in 2016 is when I entered the school. I said I would like to have this master's, and I came back to OU. When I look at the things that make up that growth mindset, I look at both cognitive intelligence and I look at emotional intelligence. Cognitive intelligence is that's why people go to school. That's why people read books. That's why, yes, you can say your IQ is this much and it's never going to be more, but what you choose to do with the IQ you've been given is part of that whole growth mindset, is pushing yourself to the limits. And we've all seen lots of wonderful stories of people who were said to never be able to do certain things, yet they excel at them and achieve greatness intellectually. And then there's the emotional intelligence, which is a huge area for growth for everyone, and it doesn't matter your age. But emotional intelligence is a set of learnable skills, like leadership is a set of learnable skills. Communication techniques, it's a set of learnable skills. And I'm not sure that people know that. I think, they think, well, somebody's either an extrovert or they're an introvert. And if you're an introvert, then you're not going to succeed in business. There's no research that says that an introvert can't. I'm an introvert, so we've already disproven that. So I think those are the two things that if I was in speaking to young people, what is it that I can really make myself aware of? Because it's more about awareness than it is knowledge. Being aware that emotional intelligence, for instance, is responsible for 60% of your job performance. Well, if it's responsible for 60% of how I am viewed by my employer as performing my job, then I better understand it. So I want to understand what emotional intelligence is, because whether they know it or not, I'm getting graded on it, right, in the workplace. 90% of top performers have high in emotional intelligence and score high in emotional intelligence assessments. So if the top performers are leveraging emotional intelligence, we also need to leverage those critical thinking skills as well. And those are very specific. That can also be trained and learned.
Since you brought up emotional intelligence as a part of this, do you have thoughts on some of the, I don't want to call it mistakes, are there typical areas that you run across where you say this is a common need for growth for people?
Wow. So emotional intelligence is made, I'm going to go around the circle here to answer your question, Scott.
Sure. Yeah.
Emotional intelligence is made up of 5 realms, if you will. And those realms are, self-perception, how I see myself, my self-regard, my how well I drive myself to have a well-rounded life. And then self-expression, how I communicate with other people. Because once we open our mouths, there's only one purpose to say anything, and that's to influence another human being or to understand another human being more deeply. Then there's the interpersonal skills. How do I build those relationships? And interestingly enough, the best, the oldest, and I think the most widely accepted emotional intelligence framework also includes decision-making skills and stress management skills. So when we look at that, the places where I see specifically somebody that I would see in a student environment would be in those relationship, interpersonal skills. And there's so many different ways that this comes up. For instance, independence. Do you feel comfortable making an independent decision without having to get a whole bunch of people, especially at work, say, yes, that's the right thing, that's the right thing? Because if you can demonstrate that you are brave enough, courageous enough to make a decision and to act on that, then that shows independence. And that's what you really need to move up in an organization. So that's one area where I see it. Some of the younger generations really like this kind of social aspect of accumulating not approval, but just consensus around something before action is taken. I think for me also in emotional intelligence is this idea of impulse control, which is having the emotional intelligence to hold back a little bit before you react to something, and catch yourself so that you can take a breath, so that you can influence more than react. That's another one that I see. Flexibility. I see it's so hard to get yourself started today, and I can't even imagine how scary it is to take a job in an organization with all these different generations sitting in it. And every generation does things. Gen Xers are different than baby boomers, are different than Gen Zs, Gen Ys. I mean, it's all, there's so many of them out there. And, I see people come in kind of a little bit hot. I mean, a little bit ready to defend their position or their right or their, what they see is the way things should be today. So that flexibility and resilience, just taking a breath and being secure in who you are. So you see that comes back to self-perception. So all of these aspects of emotional intelligence kind of work together. And in the beautiful world, they're all kind of equal. They just flow with each other. There's a flow about it.
When you were talking earlier about the rapid rate of change that is taking place in virtually every organization that we're a part of right now, one of those is the introduction of technology. So, since COVID, we're relying more and more on remote work. And it's not uncommon, I'm sure, as you've seen, to see large organizations that have 3-day in, 2-day out policies where employees are working remotely, for nearly half of the work week. As technology comes into this equation, how do you have thoughts on how you think that is potentially forcing us to need to think differently about, ideas of emotional intelligence? In other words, how is our psyche needing to adapt to these changes in organizations? I mean, you mentioned resilience, and how does it apply in sort of a contemporary organizational setting, do you think?
Yeah, this whole idea of remote work, and one of the wonderful outgrowths of COVID is that we started to see that people can be productive without being in the office. In fact, there's a lot of studies out there that are showing that people are even more productive when they're not in the office, which is a little strange. But I also think that from an emotional intelligence standpoint or from a relationship building standpoint, there's a humanness about working remotely. There's a humanness about me having my dog jump up on my lap in the middle of a call, or having one of the kids come in and want a signature on something, or want to stick their face in the screen, or because we get to know each other instead of that high-powered executive or that scary leader over in HR or technology. We get to know each other on a much more human level, and I think that that's a very positive thing. I think that organizations are struggling right now, trying to figure out what the balance is. There's a lot of, there's a lot of financial investment in brick and mortar. There are a lot of benefits to being together in the same place. One of the things that we've seen in my organization, we do a lot of leadership training, leadership development work. And I would say 99% of our clients are demanding in-person workshops now. They don't want to be on the Teams or the Zoom all day long. So I think that, again, this comes up with this flexibility of being able to, it's really all about being present, right, Scott? So it's about being conscious of the fact that I need to fully show up, whether I'm in person or whether I'm online. And again, this idea of being open, just letting down the judgment. Why isn't Bob here today in person? Well, didn't he know we were meeting in person? What do you mean he wants to dial in? Dial in. See how old I am?
Yeah.
But the that whole, okay, let's not judge it. Let's allow people to be who they are and show up the best way that they can show up. So this just a lot of empathy, um, and just understanding and willingness to do things
Yeah.
differently. I just think is critical.
I love the fact that you just brought up the word empathy. As I've talked with, I get to meet with a lot of alums in the position that I'm in, and this topic, comes up as part of just casual conversation in many of those meetings. And it's interesting because I think one of the things that I've started to discern is that employees who are working in these remote situations or hybrid, situations are starting to think a lot more about work family balance.
Hmm.
And it's a topic of conversation. And interestingly, even the alums who are, I guess I would say, in the management area of different organizations, that empathy becomes really important because they're like, I want my employees to be able to be with their family and not have, especially in larger cities where they might have 3 hours of commuting time to be able to get to and from the workplace. It's really interesting how that's become a lot more prominent in conversations.
Hmm. Yeah, it's funny. I had a job on Wall Street, and I was a leader of a group of people that we flew out every Tuesday morning, early in the morning, and we flew home every Thursday night. We were doing coaching around the country. And I said to my team, look, on Fridays, we have a meeting, and you do your expense reports and you do your travel layout for the following week, and you follow up with a bunch of notes. So you don't have to drive into Manhattan in order to get that done. And I remember my boss saying to me, if your people aren't here, they're not working. I mean, this was like an executive on Wall Street looking at me saying, Karen, I don't buy it. They need to be in the office. I said, well, they were in Chicago yesterday and you thought they were working. What's the difference between that and at home?
Yeah.
So I don't think that, I don't know this, but I'm going to guess that younger people, do not understand what a huge leap all of this stuff is for those of us that were taught from a very young age. Work ethic was about going to work, putting your whole self into it, never bringing your personal life into it, and giving your company 110%. And if you were ambitious and wanted to move up into more of a leadership kind of a role, you gave it everything. And your family came second. And you never made it to a kid's game, or you never. So all of this is shifting. And I'll tell you, I'm watching CEOs that now will not miss one of their kids' games.
Mm-hmm.
Because they can do their work from their phone while they're sitting in the bleachers.
Yeah, yeah.
And that to me is a huge breakthrough, just a huge breakthrough. I love what the younger generations are asking. I love the curiosity they've got about maybe there's a better way. You can't possibly expect me to waste more than 50% of my life going to an office every single day to earn a living so that I can have a family. It's my family that I should be concerned about. Mm-hmm. It's my health that I should be concerned about. Not that I don't want to do a good job and I want to change the world, but isn't there a better way? And I think we're really getting to that better way. And for that, I just want to applaud all of the young people who said, no, we're going to do it differently. Keep saying it.
Yeah. And, it's interesting the way that you just framed that. I'm sure that you've seen, if not even, had some experience with the idea that the necessity of well-being programs, both in organizations and also obviously at places like universities and even versions of that in K-12 systems. And it strikes me that one of the reasons why that might be so important now is that our organizations, whether they be an educational institution or a company, is still trying to figure out how to evolve to make the environment commensurate with what the values are of the people that are in the workplace now or in the educational system. I think we're trying to work towards a better match, and right now it might be slightly mismatched. Yeah.
But that's how all great transformation happens, is that we I call it small wins. We try something new. We say, ooh, that worked and that worked, that not so much. Mm-hmm. So what can we do to tweak that? Let's go try it.
Yeah.
My team knows that I think people deserve lots of chances to try, fail, and to improve. The trick is every time you fail is to find a way to improve. And I'm not even quite sure that I would call failure failure.
Yeah.
I think I would just call it hasn't worked yet.
Yeah.
And so otherwise we would have never gotten a rocket to the moon. Seems kind of silly now with all of the space stuff we're doing, but that's where we had to start. I'm sure a lot of students haven't heard it, but if you go out there and look for the John F. Kennedy's speech around going to the moon, I mean, I think that's all you have to do is say Kennedy going to the moon. And here he is talking to a bunch of 1960s or, mid 60s men with their short sleeve shirts, and all the pencils in their pockets, all these engineers, all these people that were here to listen to him. And he says, look, we're going to build a rocket out of materials we haven't even invented yet.
Yeah.
Right. So I have no idea how we're going to do this, but by goodness, we're going to do it because we're Americans and that's what we do. And I think we still all feel that way. Like if there's something that you want, you can make it happen.
I want to switch gears just slightly. Earlier, we briefly talked about critical thinking as being, something that goes hand in hand with emotional intelligence. I'm going to ask you kind of a similar question. Critical thinking is one of those big topics that is obviously a part of what we want to instill as students are in our classrooms. Are there certain areas that you consistently see as a need for growth with the clients that you interact with that connects to critical thinking that, maybe we in education should be thinking about trying to cultivate more effectively or more directly with our students?
That's a really great question. And we do a lot of work in critical thinking along with other thinking skills that are needed in order to be effective leaders. And when I look at critical thinking, it really comes down to three distinct areas where somebody can purposefully develop themselves. And this really comes from the work of Goodwin Watson back in the 60s. No, I'm sorry, back in the early 20s or mid 20s, that's 1920s, that's 100 years ago. But he created an assessment that has grown and been revalidated over and over again called the Watson Glaser. I don't know if you're familiar with it, Scott, and it really looks at critical thinking from three different junctures. And those three junctures are your ability to recognize assumptions that you're making. Like if we all just woke up in the morning and said, today I'm going to pay attention to how many assumptions I make, I think we would be shocked at how we manage our days making assumptions. And when we make assumptions, we're really operating from what we already know to be true. So once again, this is inside my mind is a certain amount of knowledge. And I use that now. I go inside. It's called insight. I go inside all day long to use the knowledge that I already have. So these assumptions are grown out of our biases. And so this idea of really evaluating or recognizing that I'm using assumptions when I'm making decisions, evaluating the arguments that I'm using in my head. Are they filled with biases? That's another area. And then the third area is, am I drawing conclusions from information that is actually factual? Or am I drawing conclusions from assumptions I'm making that aren't valid? So those are the three areas, I think, very clearly of critical thinking that can be taught. It can be developed. You can practice them. And they go hand in hand. When I think of emotional intelligence, they go hand in hand with decision making, stress management, self-perception. Do I act with arrogance? Do I think I know it all? Because once I decide I know something, how many times a day people come to me with a suggestion and I say to them, well, we're not doing that because I already decided to do this over here. I have to constantly stop myself and say, Karen, there is something worth listening to. Even if you don't use any of it, it expands what I know to be true in my head.
So if trying to think about the best way to ask this question. So if you were talking to a group of high school students, let me reframe this. So I think that when we talk about growth mindset, you and I both have a background of training in communication. we know that a lot of that self-perception that people start to develop, their emotional intelligence, all the things that you've been talking about, the growth mindset, so much of that is influenced by the messages that we would receive as we're going through school, as we're interacting with adults like our family, and people like that. So I think that, if we're really serious about the whole person and saying that a growth mindset happens over a lifespan, we have to be we have to be more precise in saying that's influenced by other people. It's not something that's genetically predisposed. It's not something that is all on my shoulders to develop myself. I have a large role in it. It's also influenced by the other people. So that's a long preamble to a question. If you were if you were if you were giving advice to parents, teachers, people that are working with students where we want them to develop a growth mindset, what are the ways that we should reinforce through our messages this idea of elasticity and continual growth, continual learning, rather than giving feedback messages that shuts students down and sort of puts them into a fixed mindset? You know what I'm saying? I mean,
Right.
how do we contrast messages that might be really formative in, students developing a growth mindset perspective?
Well, I think the best way to develop a growth mindset in somebody else is to ask questions. So often, especially as, consultants or teachers, educators, parents, we think that when somebody asks us a question, the answer is to give them information, tell them what to do. And, you know, we all learn over time that I can tell 5 people to do the same thing, and 5 people are going to interpret it differently. Whether young people have figured it out yet or not, they're much smarter than we were. There was no such thing as stress or anxiety or anything when we were growing up. There was just suck it up and go do what you're supposed to do. So I love the fact that there's a lot of information out there about looking at our health, both physical and emotional. I think that's really important. But I think that if we can just learn to ask more questions, if parents can learn to also have a learner mindset or a growth mindset when it relates to their kids, and trust that their kids have information. Most of us, when we're young, we don't really know it until we're much older, but there are imprints that are made in each of us from the time we're born with whatever our parents and our surrounding family, whatever healthy and unhealthy systems have been created, are going to imprint on us. And even if the unhealthy ones get fixed or addressed, or, a parent with some sort of in my family, it was alcoholism. Even though these things got my father overcame these challenges, and the family came together, and we all sort of said what needed to be said. We still carried with us the emotional imprints that we were given as children. Those do not go away. So if I'm a good leader, if I'm a good manager to my people, if I'm a good teacher, if I'm a good parent, I want to learn from the person that I'm supposed to be teaching. And I have to say that I see a lot of that at Ohio University. A lot of teachers that know that the thing to do is to ask a question, not a gotcha question, not to teach you something you didn't know, but to really understand you. When we can, not just empathy, I think, but when we can come at each other with grace, forgiveness, all of those other things, and just realize that we're just everybody who shows up at your workplace is wanting to do a great job, but we're all coming at it with different stuff. All of that is actually, I'll tell you, coming into play big time in corporate environments. Meditation, self-awareness. I just took a class last week, the guy in Ireland, that was a breathworks class, and it was filled with executive leaders in their 40s and 50s. And I thought that was, wow, people are actually starting to be able to bring this kind of dialogue into the workplace. So I think people are trying. I think we're figuring this out.
So I have to tell a quick story. My stories are usually not very fast, but
That's all right.
you'll appreciate this. So I'm teaching a freshman class, and it's a project-based learning class. So the big project the students are doing is they're creating social media messages that stems from a social return on investment report for an organization here in Athens that you would immediately know what it was. Social return on investment is not looking at the financial bottom line, but it's the ripple impact that a nonprofit might have because of the work that they do within a particular community. This organization had a great report done. It reads like a statistical, government report. And so my students are trying to say, how do you take that, turn it into social media messages? It's a long preamble and setup to say that because of the focus of this organization, they work with individuals who have various types of disabilities. And their preference on language is to refer to those individuals as people who are differently abled. And in their website, in their brand, that is baked into the way that they want to refer to that. I have a student in my class who is disabled, and he explicitly said, I would like to talk about that use of language. I think that my label of being disabled is something that's important for my identity. And I say this because it was that idea of grace that you mentioned. I brought people from the organization together, including a member of the board that to talk with my students about this. And it was a conversation that I would have expected to happen with university administrators. And it was a high level conversation about the use of language and how there's not a right or wrong answer, but you need to have perspective for how other people interpret it. And my freshman students were totally engaged in it. And I think it was because of that. I think it was grace. Everyone around that issue respected each other enough to listen and understand.
Yeah. And you see, when it works like that, it's amazing.
It
and
is, yeah.
Young people open their mouths and they say brilliant things because they are brilliant.
Yeah.
Those freshman students, they all bring a different perspective of the world to the table. And when we make it safe for them to speak up, this whole idea of psychological safety in the workplace, it's not about being nice to one another or being able to wear your flip-flops to work, although I'm a huge proponent of flip-flop wearing. But it's really about creating an environment where people feel safe asking for help. People feel safe bringing their ideas to the table. People feel safe challenging an idea and trying to make it better and reiterate or innovating and digging a little bit deeper into how we can make things more effective. Yeah.
When I got done with that class period, I was like, I should be done for the semester because I can't top this one. This was a great class period. Everybody grew from it. So I'm going to ask you one final question.
Mm-hmm.
And you've had no opportunity to prepare for this, but
Whatever.
if you were, based upon what you do as a consultant and the types of organizations that you work with, is there something, that you would say, this is a type of message that I wish every student back when they were in middle school, high school, sort of had taped on their mirror so that they saw it every morning, so that, 15, 17 years later, when they're in the workforce, that's going to stick with them and help them assimilate, help them, be a leader. What's that core message that you want students to have sort of in their face every day?
I think for me, I'm going to lead into this a little bit, if I might, Scott. I think one of the things I see with even my daughter, who's 26, I see it with her, is a little bit of reticence to communicate in different ways other than those ways that they have learned in their generation. And I think this idea of knowing that there are so many different generations in the workplace, and that means that we have to communicate in a way that is meaningful to each of those people, not to us. It's not about us. Somebody once said, and I wish I could quote it like a real person with somebody, here's the person who said it. But the gist of the message was that every time you choose to open your mouth and communicate, you have an opportunity to leave somebody feeling better, feeling stronger, really influence somebody in a positive way, or you have the ability to pull them down. So are you building people up when you open your mouth, or are you pulling people down when you open your mouth?
Hmm.
That's a really hard, boy, if you can like put that on your mirror, but Google it, because I'm sure there's a really cute little half sentence that kind of sums it up. But if you can, put that on your mirror in the morning and just remind yourself every single day that I have a choice. Every time I open my mouth, I have a choice to communicate in a way that builds people up or tears people down. Person by person. I don't care if it's the person in the grocery store line, or your boss, or the new person that joined the group. I don't care how other people have talked to you. You individually have a choice. That to me would be, boy, if you could start a practice of remembering that, I think we would all choose our words more carefully and be way more gracious and graceful with one another. Yeah, I think those
That is truly an important message. And just for context for the readers, Karen and I are recording this on Election Day, and I think that your advice and your mirror message, which I'm a big fan of, by the way. We have Post-it notes in my house on mirrors in our bathroom, and I think that message is, especially in today's polarized environment, is one that if we have a hope of breaking out of that polarization, it's doing exactly as you just suggested about making a conscious choice on how it is that we interact with people and what we hope the outcome of that is. Karen, it's been so great catching up with you and also having a chance of getting your perspective. I think oftentimes as teachers, whether we're in a K-12 system or in my case in higher education, we know that we're preparing students for the next step. It's less often that we hear people help translate from their minds what that next step needs to be. And if we had that intelligence, I think that, meaning that knowledge, I think that would help us in a lot of ways of talking to our students. So thank you for being here and talking through this.
Thank you. It's been great. Thank you so much for inviting me, Scott. And it was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. So my guest today was Karen Atwell, CEO and Chief Strategist at Dynamic Perspectives. We will have a link to Karen's LinkedIn profile as well as her company, just in case you would like to learn more about what it is that she does and who she is. We also appreciate you listening. I want to give a special thanks to our assistant producers, April Koska and Trinity Sweet, who helped make this happen behind the scenes. If you'd like to reach out to Teaching Matters Podcast with ideas, thoughts, or suggestions, you can email us at teachingmatterspodcast, all one word, all lowercase, at ohio.edu. And of course, you can also direct message us on social media like Instagram, Facebook, and others. Thank you for listening, and we hope everyone has a great day.